Hello everybody and welcome to video 2 of 2 for the Canon EOS Rebel XSN, also called the 3000N and the 66. The 3000N being the European market name and the 66 being the Asian and South American market name. So this camera is fully electronic. We can do nothing whatsoever with this camera except look at it or set it on a thing unless it has batteries in it. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you how to change the batteries. And for that, we've got to come to the underside of the camera. Here's the battery chamber. We're just going to pop that open. You can use your fingernails if you have fingernails, which I do not. And inside you can see two batteries. So if you have dead batteries, we're just going to pull those batteries right out of there. This camera uses two CR123 batteries. There is a decided difference in quality in these batteries by maker. Panasonic and Duracell are the two brands that I use, and they hold up the longest. The off-brand ones that I've used that are made by, like no-name fly-by-night companies off everybody's favorite mega online retailer, those tend not to work very well, and I've had a few of them swell inside of a camera. I've never had a Panasonic or a Duracell swell inside of the camera. So I would caution against using off-brand batteries for these cameras or really any other camera. So the way that the batteries are loaded is indicated on this metal plate right here. You'll see that on the side that is closer to the bottom of the screen for you, there's a symbol of a battery with a circle inside of it and no circle. That circle, of course, represents the positive, pretty standard battery loading. So we're just going to drop that positive terminal up, positive terminal down. We've now changed the batteries. Let's make sure that they're good. Batteries are good. Okay, so now that we have loaded the batteries, we know that we're going to be able to use this camera. I'm going to show you how to change lenses on it. You can change your lens at any time when you are not taking a photo, and it will not affect your photos that you've taken or will take. The reason for that is because of the shutter that's behind this mirror. Don't do what I'm about to do. So you can see that shutter that's right back there, possibly, maybe. There we go. Now you can see that shutter. That is protecting your film when you don't have a lens on the camera and you're not taking a photo. So even though you just saw what I did, I'm going to show you again. To remove the lens, you push the lens release button down. And now we're going to turn this counter or anti-clockwise and then remove the lens. To put the new lens back on, we're going to grab our different lens. This is honestly the only EF mount lens I have that works on this camera. So we're going to find the red dot on the lens and the red dot on the mount. Not a coincidence. We'll line them up, drop the lens into the flange, rotate it clockwise until it clicks. And if it doesn't move when we try to rotate it, now we know that we've mounted it correctly. And that's how you change your lens. Next up, let's load film into this camera. Now, typically with this part of the video, I'll show you film being taken up in the camera and all of that jazz. Not going to be able to do that exactly because this is a fully automatic camera. It is smarter than I am in some ways, and it's not going to let me show you film being moved through the camera. So I'm going to do kind of a truncated version of what I normally do. We're going to open up the film back like this. We're going to grab the 35mm film. We're going to drop it into the cassette chamber. So this is what it should look like when you put it in. The little knob part of it goes down towards the bottom, and then you just slide it in, angling it into the bottom first. We're going to pull out a leader just like that. This orange index is how far the film has to go into the camera in order for the camera to automatically start advancing it. So we're going to pull the leader out, and we're going to set it right back here just like that. And what you're seeing right now is perfect. That's going to load just fine. The next thing that we want to do is make sure that this film is generally flat. If your film is bowed up like this is going to jam your camera. You don't want to have your film like that. So you want to have your film, and and you might have just seen me put my finger here. Be careful. Don't do that exact thing. I know where I'm putting my fingers. It'd be very easy to put your finger through the film into the shutter and ruin it doing that. So try to not put your finger into the shutter, even with film there. We're going to pull out a leader, and you want it to look about like this, where if you look down at the camera from the top, the film's not visibly bowing out from the camera. Going to close the back of the camera. And now we're just going to turn it from off to any mode. Now, as you saw, the film was completely advanced at first. With the entry-level models of the EOS cameras from the 90s, the camera would fully advance the entire roll of film to the other side so that when it was done being used, you could just open up the camera and take the film out. Honestly, have kind of always liked that about these cameras. So this will count down. So we put a 27 exposure roll of film in there. As I take some photos, you can see that that's counted down. So one of the things about this camera that is really nice, as I mentioned, is it advances and then it rewinds so that you don't accidentally open up your film after you've taken all of your photos and ruin an entire roll, because film is one and done. And if film can record light a single time in a controlled manner with a proper shutter speed and aperture to create a photo, or in an uncontrolled manner by absorbing all of the photons that reach it, like this. If you were to open up your film back, the film door, with film in your camera like this, all of the film that is outside of this cassette would be erased. It would not record any images in the future, and it would also erase any photos that were on it, although since this film has been pre-advanced, it would really just eliminate any photos that were yet to be on it. You could still take it to the lab and get however many photos are in the cassette here and recover those with this model of camera, which is nice. But I want to show you what happens with the film in this camera when you load it. So you load it, and you saw us take the leader over to this side, and then it pre-spooled all 27 exposures over on this side of the camera here. And then as the photos are taken, it rewinds them back into the cassette over here. At any rate, the process is that as you take a photo, it'll be rewound into the cassette. Okay, so you've gone through your entire roll of film, and you've taken all of your photos. Now you can safely open up the back of your camera, and you see here that this is what your film cassette looks like. This is ready to go off to the lab, and because the leader is entirely inside of the cassette now, you know you're not accidentally going to reuse this film. So the next thing that we're going to do with this camera is talk about how to use the flash. There are two ways to use the flash with the XSN. The flash sync speed on this camera is 1/90th of a second. We'll talk about that in a second. And you can use the flash either with the on-camera pop-up flash here or with the hot shoe right here, in which case you could just mount a more powerful flash onto the camera directly, because the pop-up flashes, which you cannot also use at the same time, by the way, are not really all that powerful. So what do I mean when I say that the shutter speed, the flash sync speed, is 1/90th of a second? With focal plane curtains like this, you have two curtains, and they block the film from the light. When you take a picture, the first one opens, and then the second one drops. And then when the film advances, they reset like this, so that the film is only exposed to light when a photo is being taken. At 1/90th of a second, your first curtain drops. The entire film plane is exposed to light for just shy of a 90th of a second. And then the second curtain closes, and then they reset. And that is the fastest shutter speed at which that happens. So what about a 1/500th of a second shutter speed? Well, in that case, the first curtain would start, and then the second curtain would come behind it, and then it would get to the bottom, and then they'd reset. So during that 1/500th of a second shutter speed, you have a thin slit of film that's receiving light. So if you were to fire your flash either here or here, I'm honestly not entirely sure which, the flash would fire, and you'd have a thin strip of film either at the top or the bottom of your negative that's illuminated by the light of your flash but the rest of it would be dark because it would be blocked by that shutter curtain. So to use a flash, you have to use a 1/90th of a second or slower. Okay, but what happens if you have a 10-second exposure? Well, same concept. First curtain opens, the entire film plane is exposed to light for just shy of 10 seconds, and then the second curtain closes and then they reset. And when the flash fires in that 10 seconds, it's functionally the same in terms of the film's ability to see light and record light, whether it's a 10-second exposure, a 3-day exposure, or a 1/90th of a second exposure. I should say that 3-day example is a bit hyperbolic. So let's talk about some flash technique that you can use. This right here is the absolute worst possible place to have a flash. Right on top of your lens, pointing exactly at your subject. And the reason for that is because when the light from your flash leaves your flash, reaches your subject, bounces back to your lens, that light is coming from your flash like this. Imagine it being like a flat wave of light. It's going to reach your subject and bounce back. It will always be flat. Your subjects will look flat. And that's not a flattering appearance for any subject. Maybe a sheet of paper, but even then I would say probably not. So your pop-up flash is really only for emergency situations. I strongly recommend avoiding using a pop-up flash. So that means a more powerful flash in your hot shoe is a better idea, right? Well, sort of. If we mount this into your camera's hot shoe right here, what do we have? The exact same structure. Flash, leaving the light leaves the flash, reaches your subject, bounces back towards your lens, and you have the exact same situation with very flat lighting. So there are a couple of things you can do. What you want to do is mimic the way that we see people being illuminated all the time. And if you think about when you're outside, the sun's above you. If you think about when you're indoors, your lights are in the ceiling above you. Or if you're outside at night walking along the street with your friends, the street lights are, again, above you. People see each other lit from above the vast majority of the time, and that's what we think of as being natural and flattering. So we want to mimic that. So I'm going to turn this on its side so it's just kind of a little bit easier to see with how tightly cropped this video is. And what we're going to do is we're going to tilt the flash up like this. So if you imagine that right here, that you've turned your head sideways, let's pretend, and that you're holding this upright, with the light bouncing upwards, it can bounce off the ceiling, reflect back to your subject, and then back to your lens. And that's going to have your flash mimic the lighting in the room or wherever else you would be. Okay, well, you're taking a photo outside. You could just shoot this straight into the air and it will never reach your subject. If you have a wall nearby, getting a flash that articulates, that swivels rather, as swiveling being side to side, articulating being up and down. If you get a flash that swivels off to the side like this, now what you can do is bounce this off of a wall and have something that looks pretty close to natural lighting, certainly far better than this. So another thing that you could do is, for relatively inexpensive costs now, you could pick up a radio frequency adapter to plug in here and then put the radio frequency receiver on your flash, hand hold this, and use the autofocus on your XSN, trigger the flash, and then you now have a lot of control over exactly how you can sculpt the light, because you can hold the flash up and kind of point it downward. You can hold it in different locations, experiment with different lighting placement. So that's another really useful way of going about flash photography with this camera that can really improve your results. And one last thing that we need to talk about with flash technique is it's a really good idea, since the sync speed is 1/90th of a second, to shoot either in manual. Actually, manual is going to be the best mode for using a flash with this camera. Shoot it at 1/90th of a second, figure out what your appropriate aperture should be, set it to that aperture, and then take your pictures that way. You could do it in shutter priority mode, Would not recommend that because shutter priority mode is not necessarily going to, actually on this camera, I don't think it will, unless you have some specific Canon speed lights, take the power of the flash into account when calculating the aperture. So realistically, for flash use, you would want to use a manual shutter speed and aperture selection. Okay, so those are some of the basics for this camera. Let's dive a little bit more in depth and start talking about everything on this mode dial and what it is and how it works. Okay, so the mode dial right here is going to give you all access to all of your different shooting modes. We're going to start right up here at the top. And you saw earlier in the video where I had it at rewind and held rewind, and it rewound a partial roll of film. That's what that does. ISO allows you to override the ISO setting in your film. So for instance, here is some 400 ISO color film. And you can see the DX code readers, the code right here. The DX code readers inside the camera will read this and know that it's 400 ISO film. But you know, there's just tons and tons of light. Today I'm out in a ski resort and it's snowy and 400 is just too fast for this camera. Well, I can go into ISO here and I can dial this back to, let's say, 100. And then I can tell the photo lab to pull process this to stops. This allows you to override the DX code ISO setting to pull process, giving the film more light than it should have with less development, or push process, giving the film less light than it should have, rather, and more development time in the chemistry for specific situations, looks, different lighting, things like that as needed. The other thing that this is good for is if you have a film that does not have a DX code on it, like this one does not, and you need to manually set your film ISO when you load the film. This next mode right here is called ADEP. It's either automatic depth of field or aperture depth of field. I forget exactly what that stands for. But the way that this works is that the camera will look at items that are in one or more of these autofocus points here, and it will automatically select the depth of field, the aperture setting, and also then therefore the shutter speed, that will allow you to have things that are in proper focus. So let's say you've got your camera right here, okay? And you're going to take a picture of your 3 friends, 2 rolls of film and a battery, and they are close, medium, and far from your camera. ADEP will have the camera automatically calculate how to get all 3 of them in focus in the same photo. With ADEP, it's an automatic mode. There's nothing really that you can adjust. It's just going to do what it does, and you're going to like it or not. Doesn't matter. You don't have a say in it. M is for full manual. This is the mode that's going to teach you the most because it's going to let you make the most mistakes without apology or correction. So basically, in full manual, the camera will give you a meter reading. Along the bottom of the viewfinder, there's going to be a scale that goes from -2 to +2 over on the lower right side. And there'll be a bar beneath it. And basically, if it's flashing over on the +2 or on the -2, it means you are more than 2 or stops over or under. So either you're giving the film way too much light or way too little. But if you tell the camera to do that, it will do that because you're in full manual mode. What you'll want to do in full manual mode is adjust the shutter speed by rotating the command dial here, or the aperture by holding, oh, you can see the scale right there, by the way, as well. That's exactly what it looks like. Or the aperture by holding the AV button and rotating the dial until you get a shutter speed and an aperture where that black bar underneath your numerical scale is centered. There we go. So that's what a properly exposed manual exposure looks like. Almost there. There we go. That's what a proper manual exposure looks like. 1/45 of a second at f11. Sounds correct to me. I'm trusting the camera. has a good meter. So in manual mode, the camera will do exactly what you tell it to do, regardless of what is right or wrong. And to adjust the shutter speed, you rotate the dial. To adjust the aperture, you hold the AV button and then adjust the dial like that. Next one down is aperture priority shooting. In aperture priority shooting, which is AV, also stands for aperture value in Canon terms, you're going to pick the aperture and the camera is going to pick the best shutter speed. For 90% of my shooting, this is the mode that I use. I find this to be very creatively beneficial because I can pick the depth of field that I want, which is really the thing that I am most focused on when I take a photo, much more often than shutter speed, by the way. And it's also because it's semi-automatic. The camera does some of the thinking for me. It's very quick. So in AV mode, you just use the command wheel to adjust the aperture and select the one that you want. And then the camera will tell you what the shutter speed is going to be, and it will do it. So you can see as I take the photos that we'll go here to f1.8. The shutter speed is going to be, what's that, 1/2000th of a second, I think. Now if we go all the way to f22 on the other side, 1/15th of a second. So when I tell the camera what the aperture is going to be, it tells me what the shutter speed is going to be. TV, for shutter priority or time value, is exactly the opposite. We're going to tell the camera what we want the shutter speed to be, and it's going to tell us what the aperture is. So this is really useful. Let's say we're out shooting sports, and we want to park this at 1/2000th of a second and freeze as much of the motion as we can. We can do that. And as long as that number isn't flashing, then the camera will take a photo. If the number is flashing, that means that there is either not enough light or too much light. And that shutter speed is not one we can use with the apertures that are available on the lens that we have. But because that's not flashing, there we go. Or let's say that it's in the evening, low light, and we want to take a picture of a waterfall or a fountain and have the water be very blurry. And we know that a 6-second exposure is going to be really good for that. We can tell it to do a 6-second exposure. It's going to give us the proper aperture for our lighting conditions. Take that 6-second exposure, and now our waterfall or fountain will have lovely blurry water. P stands for program mode. And in program mode, the camera decides everything for you. You just park it in P, and it's going to pick the best aperture and shutter speed for the scene that you put in front of it. Now, one thing that makes program mode different from what we're going to see next in the scene modes is that if you push the AV button down on the back and rotate the command wheel, you can do what's called program shifting, which is basically a forced underexposure to go this way, or a forced overexposure if you go that way. So you can force the camera to either do a longer or shorter shutter exposure, either with adjusting the aperture or the shutter speed. It's up to the camera what it's going to do with program shifting using this technique. Program shifting can be very useful if you're out and you have a strongly backlit subject, like you're sitting underneath an awning and there's a beach behind you and you want to take a picture of this person who's in the shade with you. Or if you're at a sporting event and accidentally drew the wrong tickets and you're sitting with the sun facing you and you want to get pictures of the rally cars or the runners or whatever running toward you, but the sun's behind them, it's going to throw off all of your images if you don't program shift. Off button turns the camera off, or at least puts it to sleep. The magic green box is full auto. You have no control over anything. You cannot program shift. The camera is going to decide exactly what it wants to do, and you have zero input. The big difference here between green box and P is that with P you can program shift, with green box you cannot. Now we get down here into what are called the scene modes, and that's these 5 dudes right here. And they have different symbols that indicate what they are: portrait, landscape, macro, sports or action, and night portrait. So the way that portrait works is, generally speaking, it's going to turn off your flash, and it works best with longer lenses. So if you have the kit, I think this used to come with a 35-80 or 35-70, something like that. If you have that, or if you have the 35-105, then this works best at that longer range, the 105 or the 80, whatever it is. If you have the fast 50 like I have on here, it will work as well. And what it's going to do is it's going to pick the fastest aperture it can, and that's going to help give you a nice blurry background. You can also set your portrait scene shots up for success by putting your portrait about 10 feet in front of whatever is behind them, because that will let the camera shoot at the longer focal length, at a wider aperture with a shallower depth of field, and give you a blurry background behind your portrait. Landscape is basically the exact opposite. With landscape images, you want to have a nice wide field of view. So on the kit lens, you'd want to set it at a 35mm focal length, and this will use the smallest aperture that it can to give you the greatest depth of field. And so with landscape, it's again going to turn off the flash, but it's going to work best at wide focal lengths, and it will give you a small depth of field, a small aperture, so that the maximum amount of the scene is in focus. Macro lens, or macro photos, also called close-up, also tend to work better with longer lenses, and I believe that they also disable the flash. Portraits might not disable the flash. Portrait might only disable the pop-up flash. Anyway, close-up photos tend to disable the flash. If you're using something like the kit 35 to 80, you again want to have this on the longer range, something like in the 50 to 80mm length. And this will try to force you to get as close as possible to your subject. All lenses have a closest focus point. This lens that we have right now will focus as close as about a foot, which is really pretty darn good for a 50mm lens. And with your close-up or macro setting, you want to be at your lens's closest focus point for the best results. This will also try to stop down your lens a little bit so that you can get maximum depth of field with your close focus. Sports or action right here is going to give you the fastest shutter speed that it can. So basically, if you imagine this is sort of like program mode, but biasing towards the fastest possible shutter speed that your camera can manage. Then night portrait is a really interesting one, and what this does is that this will fire your flash and give you a long exposure. So let's say that, for instance, you're sitting with a friend and you guys are out on the waterfront, and then there's a cityscape behind you, okay? So you say to your friend, sit on that bench, I'm going to take a picture of you. Put it into night portrait mode. You can use the flash with this. You actually would want to pop up the flash or use your hot shoe with a flash controller over here. This is going to, and what you'll do is you'll tell them sit still until I tell you to sit up. Camera's going to take a flash and then a long photo, or long photo and then flash. I'm not sure which order it is with this camera. So at any rate, what's going to happen is that the flash will illuminate the person who's sitting on the bench that's near you, and then the long exposure that could be a handful of seconds after that or before it, whichever the case may be, will allow the background cityscape to also be illuminated behind the person you're taking a photo of. If they stand up in the middle of the exposure after the flash fires, for instance, then what's going to happen is it's going to look like they have lights glowing through them. You don't want that look. That's why it's important for them to stay seated until the photo's done. All right, next thing we're going to do is talk about the autofocus point selection button right here. Now, you can watch it right here on the LCD screen. Let's prop this up to make that a little bit easier to see. You can follow along on the LCD screen or in your viewfinder. You'll see the exact same thing in your viewfinder along the bottom as you will on the LCD screen here. We're going to push the AF button, and everything else in your viewfinder or the LCD screen will disappear except those three dots. Let's try that again. And now you use the command wheel to scroll through left, center, right, or 3. This will force the camera to pick your left autofocus point, center autofocus point, and right autofocus point, or the camera will pick whichever is best based on the action in front of it to focus on. So how is this useful? Your autofocus points are right about here, here, and here, okay, roughly. And they're marked on your viewfinder focus screen if you want to look through your eyepiece and see them. Let's say you're sitting at a sporting event and you know that you're going to have a lot of action coming in this way, right? You're like a duck race and there's a bunch of ducks that are going to be running along the dirt right here. and you want to get a picture of a duck like kicking up some dirt as it's right here in this autofocus point with just a whole bunch of track for it to run into, because that's a really good and reliable structure for a sports photo. Why a duck race? Because I thought that would sound funny. Anyway, you set your autofocus point to your left autofocus point, and then when the duck starts coming around here, you put that left autofocus point on it, and then you track it as it runs, taking a bunch of shots until it's run around the corner, and one of them should turn out fairly well. All right, but what about the center autofocus point? This is good for portraits. Let's say you're center aligning portraits for a portrait project. You can force the camera to only use the central autofocus point and then put, say, your subject's dominant eye in the center of the frame, and that will allow your subject to have to have their eye be in proper focus. And then, of course, just the auto select is a really good general autofocus setting for this camera. So that's how you select autofocus points and what a couple of those could be used for. Next, we're going to look at this function button right here, and what we're going to see is over on the right side of the screen, we're going to scroll through different functions. And so 0 and 1 are going to be our selection right here. So we select the function to get into each thing. The arrow is going to tell us what we are set to. And then we use the command wheel to turn the function on or off. Okay, 0 being off, 1 being on. So this first one right here, the triangle's next to that eyeball. That's red eye reduction with your flash that pops up here, or with your Canon speedlight flashes that will work with some of them as well. So 0 is off, 1 is on. If you're going to be taking a lot of flash photos of people at a party or just hanging out with your friends, whatever, you might want to turn that on, because that will pulse the flash before you take the photo so that they are less likely to have their eyes glowing red in color photos. This triangle now is next to something that looks kind of like a Wi-Fi symbol. It's actually a speaker, and that's going to be 0 or 1 for off or on. Do you want your camera to beep annoyingly when you do different things? Like, let's see if I can make it happen. Well, I don't know why this camera's not cooperating and beeping annoyingly like it's supposed to, but 0 will silence the speaker on your camera, and 1 will turn the speaker on so that it beeps annoyingly when it does different things. And this is basically like if you're in a place where you want to have as quiet a camera as possible, you do want to make sure that's set to 0. The next one of these is multiple exposures, and this is not a 1 and 0. This is a 1 through 9. So this is how you would take multiple exposures. We'll talk about that a little bit later after we talk about how to take an actual photo in this video. But what you're going to do is you're going to figure out how many exposures you want on your frame. 1 is for a single exposure, double, triple, whatever it is. And then as you use them, it will count down. And then after you get done with your multiple exposure, it will advance to the next frame automatically. And then reset you to a single exposure. The last function we're going to look at is bracketing. So we'll hit the function button, we'll bring up the bracketing, and we'll use a command wheel. And you can see those 3 dots spreading out from the center and this number up here. This is basically we're bracketing the image by taking 3 images separated by 1 stop. What does that actually mean? Well, let's say that we have 1/180th of a second and f4 as our proper shutter speed. Let's take a photo. We're actually going to take all 3 photos there, right? This one does not auto reset, by the way. 1/180th and f4 is our proper shutter speed. And you can see, why is that? Oh, it's giving us the meter reading as well. Okay, let's try the aperture value so it works with us a little bit better. Okay, we're going to leave this parked at f4, so that's going to be fixed. Our shutter speed is now 350. That's a proper exposure. Next one is should be, so that's 750 is our second one, and 180 is our third one. So basically, what this does when you go in here is it allows you to take 3 photos, each of them separated by up to 2 stops of illumination difference in half-stop increments, so that, let's say, for instance, you're back at that beach scene, right? You've got your friend sitting underneath the awning there with you. You can use this to take 3 photos. I just don't know which one's going to turn out well, but hey, at least one of them will, right? So that's a good way to make sure that you don't miss a photo. Yeah, you waste 2 frames, but you get a good and important photo out of it anyway. You want to see a really neat trick with bracketing? We're going to go into program here. Okay, so if we bracket, it's going to give us 3 different shutter speeds, and it's going to show you which one it's doing as you take each of them. Watch the black bars underneath the meter there. So it's going to go proper, under, over, right? What happens if we, let's do this. Let's make these a little bit closer together so it's easier to see, right? What happens if we program shift in program while we're bracketing? I know for a fact that if I do a half stop over, that image is going to be way too bright, but I'm not sure, do I need a half stop under or 1 stop or 2? I don't know. So if I program shift so that the most exposed image is a properly exposed image, now I'm going to have 2 images that are underexposed, and one of those is going to turn out right. So you can use program shifting in conjunction with bracketing to hedge your bets if you want to intentionally underexpose for low-key images or in very bright light, or overexpose for high-key images or in very dark light. So that's another thing you can do with bracketing that is a very powerful use of the tool. So the next thing we're going to do, we've covered the AV button incidentally as we've gone through all of those different functions. We have not yet touched the asterisk button. So what does it do? The asterisk is the auto exposure lock button. And basically you half press the shutter button in autofocus mode to focus. Let's do that right now. So focus is locked. Now you press the asterisk button and that locks your exposure settings. And now you can recompose your image and take your photo. If it's going to let me, I'm sitting too close to the lens. Let's try this again. It likes that. There we go. So the asterisk button will lock your exposure. You're holding down your shutter button halfway after focus is locked will lock your focus. So what does this do for you? Okay, let's go back to that scene where you're sitting underneath the awning with your friend. Well, it's really bright behind your friend, and bracketing is just really confusing. I don't understand that. I'm not going to try that. I don't want to waste the film. I'm on my last frame of my last roll for the entire vacation, but I want this photo. Okay, so we can use this technique here. What we're going to do is you're going to hold down the shutter button halfway. You're going to get your focus on your friend. You're going to force, if you need to, the proper focus. You're going to keep holding this down. Now you're going to tilt the camera down at the ground toward the pavement, and you're going to lock your exposure while you lock your focus. Now you're going to bring your camera back up, and you're going to make sure that your friend is still in proper focus, and then you're going to take the photo. Okay? And what that will do is that will have your exposure be locked to the lighting that's in the shaded area under the awning, because you're locking your exposure to the pavement that you're sitting on in the shade. And you're keeping your focus locked here. And then you can compose your image exactly however you want and get the person you're sitting with under the awning in proper illumination with proper focus, without the camera being confused by the very bright light that's at the beach behind where you guys are sitting. All right, next up, let's talk about how to change the metering modes in this camera. As I mentioned at the very beginning, this camera has evaluative, center-weighted, and spot metering. Evaluative is the default, and it's always going to be used in every single case except 2 very specific cases. The first one is spot, which Canon calls partial metering. It's two different terms for the exact same thing. What that does is the central 9.5% of the screen. So let's say that what you're looking at right now is what you're seeing in the viewfinder. an area about the size of the circle of this roll of film right in the center of the viewfinder, and it's marked on your focusing screen, will provide 100% of your meter reading, and that's partial metering. And that will be used automatically when you use the asterisk button for auto exposure lock in the exact situation we just talked about in the previous section. Okay? Center weighted metering is the other setting, and it's used with full manual shooting. So if you're in full manual mode, you've got center weighted metering. You cannot have partial. You cannot have evaluative. If you're in AV, TV, any of the scene modes, you've got evaluative unless you use the asterisk, and then you've got partial. Okay, we have covered everything that there is in this camera except how to actually take a picture. So I'm going to set it in manual mode. We've gone over how all of these work, okay? We've got our batteries loaded, we've got our film loaded, we've selected the correct autofocus point or points, we've got the function set up exactly as we want, so on and so forth. Now let's take a picture. Manual and autofocus are switched on the lens right here. Look through the viewfinder, line up your scene, make sure what you want to have be in focus is in focus, and hit the shutter button. That's it, that's how you do it, okay? But I want to be in the photo, I don't want to just take it. Hit the self timer, and now it's going to count down from 10 seconds to 0, and then it's going to take the photo. With the self timer, it's a good idea to use manual focus. And you can use autofocus, by the way, but it's really good to have manual focus. Pick a point, stand there, or have your friend standing there, and then do the self timer that way. And then hit the self timer button to turn it off. Okay, so what about double exposures? Let's talk about, we talked a little bit about the process in the function menu right here, where you select the number of exposures, 1 through 9, and then it counts down and then advances the film. Let's talk a little bit about the science behind multiple exposure. Let's say that 1/125th of a second and f/5.6 is a proper shutter speed and aperture. Okay, we have those dialed in right here. Film likes to have a certain number of photons reach it to create a properly exposed image. So if this is our properly exposed image, if we take 2 images on the same negative space with those settings, it's going to get twice as much light as it wants. You can still work with that negative, but what it's going to do is it's going to cause it to become what's called thick, dense, or dark. Those are 3 words that mean the same thing. The film is approaching the maximum number of photons that it can record. And what happens when you have a thick negative is that you get a lot of digital noise if you scan it, or if you're in the dark room, you're going to get the print times are a lot longer, and in both cases, the contrast is a lot lower. So, with a multiple exposure, let's say you're doing 2, you want to cut the amount of light in half. It's really easy to do that in your manual mode, by the way. So we're going to do a double exposure here. If we know that 1/125th of a second and f/5.6 is a proper exposure, and we need half as much light, we can adjust the shutter speed. And if we go to 1/250th of a second, because these are fractions, that's half as much time, should theoretically mean half as many photons. Take the first double exposure, take the second double exposure, and now we have taken a single negative with a proper amount of illumination across 2 different frames. Okay, but I've got one double exposure that's inside and one that's outside. Take a meter reading on the inside, and it's 1/60th of a second at f/5.6. Well, then you set it to 1/125th. You go outside, and it's 1/500th at f/5.6. Well, then you set it to 1/1000th. Nothing says that these settings have to be the exact same for each frame. All you have to do is cut the amount of light, either with the shutter speed or the aperture, in half for the given amount of light that you have in the half of the double exposure that you're taking right now. Triple exposures, it would be like 1/3 as much light, and so on and so forth. By the time you get beyond triple exposures, they kind of get a little bit hard to manage. And that is it. We have now covered every single thing that the Canon EOS Rebel XSN 3000N66 can do, and explained how to use all of those things for your photography. Have a good day. Thank you everyone for watching. If this video was helpful and useful to you, please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know that I'm on the right track and that I'm producing and creating content which is helpful to you. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please leave those in the comments section below. I'm pretty good about responding every couple of days and answering whatever questions you have to the best of my ability. If you'd like to subscribe to find out when I have more videos about how to use cameras, photographic techniques, or the best practices for the tools of the trade, by all means please subscribe and check that notifications bell to be alerted when new content arrives. If you'd like to support the channel by joining with a membership, there are now membership options for this channel at different tiers that will give you different benefits if you would be interested in that. And one last thing, thank you everyone very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next videos. Won't we, Steinbeck? What's that look about?